wastewater management ideas on this episode of Barnstable Today. It's Tuesday, February 21st, 2012. I'm Sarah Colvin. The Citizens Advisory Committee went before Town Council last week to discuss its preliminary plans for dealing with wastewater here in Barnstable. The committee first explained the reasons for and components of the project.
So why is the town presently planning for what would be by far the largest capital expenditure in its history? For many years, we've known that wastewater discharges, primarily from our septic systems, are impacting our environment, placing our public water supplies at risk, and damaging our coastal estuaries and embayments and our inland lakes, ponds, and streams. The effects of excess nitrogen in our groundwater have been seen in increasing levels of nitrogen in our public water supplies, and our coastal estuaries have been impacted by excess nitrogen to the extent that many can no longer support viable habitats for eelgrass, shellfish, or other aquatic species. As a result of all of this, we're receiving increasing regulatory pressure from pretty much all levels of government, federal, state, and local. And as you are no doubt aware, we are also the indirect subject of litigation by the Conservation Law Foundation, whose ultimate goal is obviously to force a timely solution to these problems. The purpose of the CWMP project is to develop an environmentally and economically sound plan to address these wastewater issues, to comply with present and future regulations, and hopefully to preserve and maintain the quality of life in this town. It bears noting here that while presently the regulatory pressure is largely directed towards the nitrogen overloading in our coastal embayments coming from our septic systems, this project is also addressing other nutrients and contaminants that are finding their way into the aquifer from our septic systems, road runoff, fertilizer, and other sources. And we're also focusing on the impacts of all of these things, not only to the coastal estuaries, but to our lakes and ponds, as well as to our public drinking water supplies. We began with the development of nitrogen limits for coastal embayments. We then conducted an assessment of the environmental problems facing us and the causes thereof. And you have our needs analysis report in front of you. The first two volumes here. Most recently, we identified the environmental problems facing us and the causes thereof. And you should also have a copy of our alternative screening analysis. And I understand that this is hard to wade through. There's a lot of stuff here. But there are some super executive summaries at the beginning of these things, and they are very readable and understandable. Stearns & Wheeler is presently conducting a more detailed evaluation of the alternatives left after our initial screening process, and we'll be reviewing and critiquing that analysis as it develops. We'll then reconcile the planning alternatives into a comprehensive written plan, and ultimately regulatory approval for the plan will be sought from the county and state levels.
The committee discussed nitrogen limits and its sources.
The MEP also identified the sources of the nitrogen entering our estuaries and their relative contributions to the estuaries. And the MEP confirmed what prior studies had told us, that approximately 70% of the total nitrogen load in our embayments comes from our septic systems. And about 85% of that load amounts to about 85% of the controllable load after atmospheric deposition is removed. So we can control essentially 85% of the nitrogen load in our coastal embayments.
The committee assessed needs and proposed solutions.
So how are we handling our wastewater at present in town? Our existing public and private wastewater facilities include, of course, the thousands of individual on-site Title V and less septic systems which serve a majority of the town. These systems provide minimal septic treatment, however, and they're really only designed as really an efficient way of getting the wastewater into the groundwater. 71 properties in town have innovative alternative systems, which are so-called IA systems. They perform some treatment and are designed to potentially remove about 50% of the nitrogen, but they're otherwise limited in their ability to treat wastewater for other contaminants. And it should be noted that in practice, we're finding that a significant number of these systems are not operating to their design guidelines. The town is also served, well, the town isn't served. There are two private wastewater facilities in the town serving a nursing home and a shopping center. And the town has three public wastewater facilities, the Hyannis Water Pollution Control Facility, or what we call the septic treatment plant here in Hyannis, and the one in Marston's Mills at one of the schools there right around the corner from the landfill. And lastly, there's the Red Lily Pond cluster system. All that really is, though, is a collection system, and it doesn't provide any enhanced treatment to the waste. First, the TMDL regulations will require significant reduction of nitrogen loading in many of our estuarine watersheds, and that specifically means the removal and/or treatment of septic waste generated in those watersheds. To protect our drinking water supplies, our wastewater treatment facilities will likely be required to enhance their treatment capacity, as well as possibly to treat for the contaminants of emergent concern. And in some areas, water quality problems with our lakes and ponds will likely require treatment of septic effluent in their watershed areas. And lastly, that the town's foreseeable growth should be managed and directed towards areas with the least environmental impact, or at least where present or planned wastewater infrastructure will mitigate those impacts. We came up with 5 plans, 3 of which are decentralized and 2 of which are centralized. The first 2 plans are decentralized. We'll discuss decentralized Plan A. That would include expanded use of IA systems, the innovative alternative individual septic systems, particularly in more remote areas of the town, needing less wastewater treatment. It also includes the use of multiple, relatively small satellite treatment facilities and expansion of the Hyannis facility to treat more waste with the development of remote discharge sites for the plant's increased effluent. The second decentralized plan is very much like the first decentralized plan, except that it places much less emphasis on IA systems and would limit the satellite facilities to 2 relatively larger facilities to be built in the western part of town. The 2 centralized plans, they call for no new satellite treatment facilities and expansion of the wastewater facility in Hyannis to treat the septic effluents from all areas to be sewered. The first differs from the second in that, like the other plans, we would have to develop more recharge sites within the town to deal with the plant's additional effluent. The second centralized plan was designed in response to the exorbitantly large cost of treatment for CECs, or contaminants of emerging concern, because that would be necessary to the extent that any of our plants' effluent is recharged within a zone of contribution to a public well. So this plan is similar to the first centralized plan, except the plant's treated effluent will be discharged not through recharge to the aquifer, but through an ocean outfall. And yes, we do recognize that an outfall would face significant regulatory and political hurdles, but we felt that it was important enough to warrant further study. The last plan, also a decentralized plan, was also developed in sympathy to the anticipated cost of CE treatment. Here, the collection and treatment of septic waste would follow the second decentralized plan, little IA treatment whatsoever, little IA systems whatsoever, and some collection facilities and treatment facilities throughout probably the western part of the town. But here we suggest that the relocation of public water supply sites could possibly obviate the need for CEC treatment at each of the treatment facilities. But this would, of course, require cooperation among the town's 4 very independent water supply companies at this point. Of course, we can elect to do nothing. And that would mean further degradation of our lakes, ponds, our estuaries, enhanced risk to our public water supplies, and probable adverse economic impacts and maybe even declining property values. I think just as important, doing nothing would almost certainly lead to some form of court or regulatory mandate to address the wastewater issues.
Next steps include more public hearings, review of comments, and further evaluation. Town Council members briefly discussed the proposals during last week's very busy meeting. You can view that full report online at town.barnstable.ma.us. With Barnstable Today, I'm Sarah Colvin.